The storm had no mercy that night. Snowflakes pounded against the glass like 1,000 tiny fists, and the wind howled so fiercely it sounded like wolves circling the diner. From the highway barely visible through the blizzard, North Star, diner looked like the last glowing ember in a world gone dark, a single rectangle of golden light standing against the mountain's rage. Inside the booths were empty, the coffee pot hissed softly, and a man with shoulders broad enough to bear 2 wars leaned silently against the counter. Martin Greaves wiped the same spot on the counter for the 3rd time, though it was already spotless. His worn olive-green jacket, a relic from another life, hung on the coat rack by the door. His apron, white but faded, carried faint coffee stains from 100 shifts. His hands were strong, but tonight they trembled slightly. In his pocket, folded crisp, but heavy as stone, was the letter from the bank. 7 days. 7 days until the only thing keeping him tethered, the diner, would be stripped from him. "Daddy." The soft voice broke through the silence. 9-year-old Ellie peeked out from the kitchen, her brown hair tied up in 2 uneven braids, her small hands gripping a sketchbook. Her smile was warm, but her eyes were too knowing for a child her age. "You should be asleep," Bug Martin said, mustering a half-smile. "I couldn't," she admitted, padding toward him in her socks. "The wind sounds angry." She climbed onto a stool and opened her sketchbook, showing him a drawing of the diner with its lights on. Outside, snow and darkness loomed, but in the center, her crayons had pressed so hard, the page nearly tore. The diner's glow blazed like a beacon. Martin swallowed hard. He touched the drawing gently, as though it might break. "That's why we keep it open," he whispered. "If anyone's out there lost or tired, they'll see the light." At that moment, a blast of wind rattled the door. Martin's jaw tightened. He knew the storm would only grow worse, and no one in their right mind would be traveling through the Rockies at this hour. Still, he kept the coffee hot, the lights burning, because principle mattered more than logic. And then, in the distance over the roar of the storm, came a sound that didn't belong. At first it was faint, nearly drowned by the wind. Then it grew louder. A low, guttural growl, steady and unrelenting. Headlights cut through the snow, 15 beams, slicing the darkness, swaying like restless spirits. Ellie gasped. "Daddy." Do you hear that Martin's heart thudded? He knew that sound. Harley Davidsons. 15 of them. Engines snarling as if daring the storm to fight back. The diner windows trembled as the convoy pulled up outside, chrome and steel glistening beneath layers of snow. Tires screeched on the icy pavement. Boots stomped against the frozen ground. Shadows loomed broad and menacing, leather and steel merging with the night. The bell above the door jingled. One by one, the bikers entered. Faces, hard eyes hidden beneath bandanas, frost clinging to their jackets. They filled the room with silence heavier than the storm itself. Martin didn't flinch. He poured coffee into the first mug, slid it across the counter, and said nothing. His daughter, small yet brave, climbed down from her stool and carried a stack of clean towels to them. Her smile didn't waver, even as she tilted her head up at men who looked like shadows carved from war. For a moment, the only sounds were the hiss of the coffee machine and the creak of boots on linoleum. Then, from the back of the group, a younger biker stepped forward. His face was pale beneath the grime, his lips trembling not from the cold, but from recognition. "It's you," he whispered hoarsely. His voice cracked. "It's really you." The diner seemed to hold its breath. The storm outside thundered, but inside, silence reigned. Martin met his eyes. He remembered the boy, though he said nothing. He never did. If this story has already pulled you in, take a second to tap the like button and share your thoughts below. Would you have kept the diner open on a night like this? Your voice matters, And it keeps the light burning, too. Martin turned back to the counter, his face unreadable. He picked up another mug, poured, slid it across. No explanations. No greetings. Just warmth in a world frozen over. Ellie, standing on tiptoe, handed a towel to the trembling young man. He stared at her, then at Martin, as if unable to comprehend how this quiet diner could hold so much gravity. For every man in the room, there was a story buried in the snow stories. They never told wounds, they never confessed. And whether they admitted it or not, they hadn't come here by chance. The storm had pushed them, yes. But something else, something older, something unspoken, had led them back to the man who had once carried them through their darkest nights. Martin Greaves, the silent veteran with a diner that refused to close, was no stranger to storms. And tonight, the storm had brought ghosts to his door. The storm grew thicker as the clock struck 8:47 p.m., the kind of hour when even the mountains themselves seemed to hold their breath. Outside, snow blanketed the Rockies, piling higher against the diner's windows until the world beyond looked like a white void. The neon sign North Star Diner buzzed faintly, fighting the cold with every flicker. Inside, warmth lingered, but unease had begun to seep in. 15 men and women, leather-creaking boots wet with slush, now filled the small space. They took seats without asking, some in booths, some at the counter, all silent. The hum of their Harley engines still echoed in Martin's bones, even after they cut them off. Martin poured coffee one cup at a time. His hands were steady, his face unreadable, as though serving bikers in the middle of a snowstorm was no different from serving tourists in the summer. Ellie, her braids now loose and messy, busied herself by carrying fresh towels to the dripping guests. At first her small hands trembled, but when one of the bikers, his beard white with frost, whispered a soft, "Thank you," she found her courage. Still, the silence was unnerving. They were watching him, every one of them, though none dared to speak. Until one did. From the corner booth, a young man with haunted eyes leaned forward. His jacket bore a patch Iron Wolves MC. His voice cracked as he spoke. "It's you," he whispered again, louder this time. "It has to be you." Martin didn't answer. He slid another mug across the counter, his gaze fixed on the steam rising from the coffee. But Ellie tilted her head, curiosity overcoming fear. "Daddy," she asked softly, "does he know you?" The young biker's lips trembled. He set his mug down untouched and pushed back his hood. His face was gaunt with a scar just beneath his jawline. 2 years ago, he said, his voice unsteady. "I was out on Route 89, middle of winter. Bike broke down, gas tank empty. I was ready to give up, ready to just let the snow take me." His eyes glistened, and then a truck stopped. An old man didn't ask my name, didn't ask what I'd done. He just gave me a ride, fed me, left me here in this diner. Said nothing the whole time. The man's voice faltered. He looked straight at Martin. "That was you, wasn't it?" Ellie's eyes widened. She glanced from the biker to her father, then back again. Martin's silence was answer enough. The young man's hands shook as he gripped his cup. "Name's Tucker McKean," he said, his voice lowering. "They call me Dust. I didn't know how to thank you. Until now." A murmur rippled through the group. Eyes met, nods exchanged. Stories began to emerge, half sentences, broken fragments of nights when they had been alone, desperate, and saved by a stranger who never gave his name. A tall man at the counter spoke next, his voice gravelly. "Winter of '08. My leg was bleeding bad, snow everywhere. Someone kept pressure on the wound, got me to a med truck. Didn't even tell me his name. Just left." He looked at Martin now with something between awe and disbelief. "That was you too, wasn't it?" Martin's jaw flexed, but he said nothing. His silence filled the room heavier than words. And then from near the door, a woman's voice cut through. Strong, sharp, but with an edge of tremor. Raven Calder, known on the road as Nox. She was striking in her black leather jacket, dark hair, pulled back tattoos, curling across her collarbone like fire. Her eyes, however, carried shadows far deeper than the storm outside. "You saved me," she said simply. Her words dropped like stone into water. "Years ago. After the crash, I never saw your face, but I remember the hands. Steady. Gentle." Ellie, perched on her stool, whispered as though to herself, "Daddy's hands are always like that." The bikers exchanged glances, but none dared laugh. The child's innocence seemed to break something in the room, softening even the hardest faces. For a long while, the only sound was the crackle of the old jukebox by the window, its lights dim but still flickering like stubborn fireflies. Finally, Martin spoke. His voice was low, gravelly, carrying the weight of years he never shared. "This is a place for warmth," he said, "not for stories." The bikers stilled as though his words were commandment. Yet in their silence was understanding. They didn't need his stories. They carried enough of their own. All they needed tonight was a place where the light still burned. Ellie climbed into her father's lap, resting her head against his chest. "See," she murmured, already half asleep. "I told you the light's important." Outside, the snow piled higher, burying the world in white. Inside, 15 bikers sat in silence, nursing hot coffee, and staring at the man who had once saved them from the shadows. And though no one said it out loud, each of them knew this was no coincidence. Fate had drawn them back to the diner, back to the quiet veteran who never asked for thanks. The storm outside was fierce, but the shadows inside had begun to lift. Morning in the Rockies was usually a blessing. The sun would crest the peaks, scattering diamonds across the snow, and for a brief moment the world looked clean again. But not this morning. The storm hadn't lifted. Heavy clouds pressed down on the mountains, and the wind kept dragging snow across the diner's windows like a veil determined to hide the light. Inside the North Star diner, the coffee pot hissed, and the air was thick with unspoken recognition. 15 bikers hardened by road, and regret sat scattered across booths and stools, their leather jackets dripping on the linoleum. They had come to escape the storm, but what they'd found was a man they thought they'd lost, or maybe never truly known. Martin Greaves, quiet as ever, moved behind the counter, with the same steady rhythm as the night before. He filled cups, cleared plates, and kept his eyes down. But no amount of silence could muffle the murmurs beginning to rise among the group. "Tell me I'm crazy," one man muttered, his voice hoarse. "But I swear, he's the one who dragged me out of that ditch near Denver. Broken ribs thought I was gone. Someone carried me half a mile until the EMTs came. Didn't say a word." Another leaned in, tattoos curling across his knuckles. "No, you're not crazy. Iraq, 05. I was pinned down bleeding. Somebody kept pressure on the wound until the medevac came. He never gave his name." His eyes flicked toward Martin, who was wiping down a table with maddening calm. Ellie, still in her pajamas with cartoon bears on them, perched on her stool by the counter. She swung her legs and listened with wide eyes. To her, this was simply Daddy, who made pancakes shaped like hearts on her birthday, who never raised his voice, who carried the weight of the world without complaint. She couldn't reconcile the man they described with the father she knew, but the stories poured out like ghosts released from chains. At last, Tucker Dust McKean stood up. He was the youngest among them, barely in his 20s, with restless eyes and a voice that carried more tremor than strength. He looked around the room, as if daring someone to challenge him. "You all think he saved you once," Dust said, "but some of us, he saved more than once." The diner fell into silence. All eyes turned to him. Dust swallowed hard. 2 years ago, I was ready to end it. Middle of winter, like I told you. Bike out of gas, no hope left. He showed up, put me in his truck, brought me here. Fed me, gave me a bed. Didn't ask why I looked like I hadn't slept in weeks. Didn't care that my hand shook. He took a ragged breath. He never said a word. But somehow I walked out of here alive. His fists clenched at his sides. And the thing is, I didn't even realize until last night. He's the same man. Always the same. Never asking, never judging. Just there. A ripple of understanding spread through the room. For these men and women, survival had never been about glory. It had been about moments, like those small, anonymous mercies that kept them alive long enough to fight another day. And here was the man who embodied them all, the silent figure who refused to call himself a hero. Raven Calder, leaning against the jukebox, finally spoke. Her voice was low, steady, but laced with something raw. I thought he was a ghost, she admitted. 19 years old, fresh out of a broken home, I joined a ride I shouldn't have. We crashed on a frozen road. Everyone scattered, left me bleeding. I remember a man's arms lifting me. I remember a voice, quiet as prayer, telling me to hold on. I never saw his face. Only the scarf he wore, the one stitched with words I'll never forget, to those we couldn't save. She looked directly at Martin, now eyes flashing with both anger and gratitude. And here you are, not a ghost. Flesh and blood. Martin finally paused, the rag in his hand stilled against the counter. He didn't meet her eyes, but the lines around his mouth deepened, betraying emotion he didn't want to show. Ellie's small voice broke the heavy air. Daddy, why didn't you ever tell me? He crouched beside her stool, brushing a stray lock of hair from her face. His eyes were tired, but gentle. Because, Bug, he said softly, it's not about telling. It's about doing. The bikers fell silent. No one argued. No one dared. Because in those simple words lay the truth of the man before them, a soldier who carried his ghosts, not in medals or stories, but in deeds that spoke louder than anything he could ever say. Jax Monroe, broad-shouldered and scarred, stood at the far end of the room. He had been quiet all night, but now he straightened his gaze hard and searching. Kandahar, he said suddenly. The name landed like a thunderclap. 4. Our unit was pinned down. Ambush from 3 sides. We lost half our men. There was one soldier never said a word, not once. But he carried 2 of us out under fire. Took a bullet himself and didn't even stop moving. He stepped forward slowly, his boots heavy on the tile. I never knew his name, but we called him the Silent One. And now, his voice caught and he studied Martin with eyes that burned. Now I see him standing in front of me, serving coffee like none of it happened. The room seemed to shrink. For a moment, all that existed was Martin Greaves and the lives he had unknowingly woven together, threads of kindness and sacrifice, stitched into the hearts of bikers who had thought themselves forgotten. Martin didn't answer. He simply picked up the rag again, turned back to the counter and kept wiping. But the weight of what lingered in the room was undeniable. To the bikers, he was no longer just the diner's owner. He was the man who had saved ghosts and carried them into the light. The storm never truly slept. By 3 a.m, the diner was quiet, though the wind still clawed at the windows and the snow beat its steady rhythm against the glass. Most of the bikers had dozed off in their booths, jackets pulled over their shoulders, helmets resting on tables, like weary companions. The jukebox was dark, the coffee pot finally silent, and even Martin had retreated to the back to catch a moment of rest. But not everyone slept. Raven Calder stirred in the corner booth, restless. Shadows from the neon sign played across her face, revealing the hard lines life had etched there, and the softness she tried so hard to bury. She slipped out quietly, boots barely making a sound on the checkered floor, and found herself wandering toward the faint light coming from the kitchen. There, at the small table tucked by the window, sat Ellie. The little girl was hunched over her sketchbook tongue, poking out in concentration as her crayons flew across the page. She didn't notice Raven at first, but when she did, she lit up with a smile that felt like the first sunrise after a long night. "Hi, Ellie," whispered, as if afraid to wake the others. "I was drawing you." Raven blinked, taken aback. "Me?" Ellie nodded and turned the sketchbook around. There, in uneven but heartfelt lines, was Raven on her, Harley Wind, in her hair tattoos, traced in bright colors, her eyes fierce but kind. The drawing was imperfect, but it carried a warmth that made Raven's throat tighten. "Why me?" she asked softly. Ellie shrugged as children do when their answer is both simple and profound. "Because you looked lonely. And when people look lonely, I like to draw them happy." The words struck Raven deeper than she expected. For a long moment, she couldn't speak. She sat down across from Ellie, her leather jacket creaking, her hands fidgeting with the edge of the table. "You ever get scared of the dark?" Ellie asked suddenly, her big eyes searching Raven's face. The question was innocent, but it cracked something open. Raven swallowed, her voice breaking just slightly. "All the time." Ellie leaned closer, as if sharing a secret. "Me too. But Daddy says the dark can't win if you keep even a little bit of light." She pointed at the glowing diner sign outside, half buried in snow. "See, that's why he never turns it off." Raven's chest tightened. She wanted to smile, but all she felt was the old scar burning at her back, the one she tried to forget every day. Memories returned unbidden, the crash, the sound of metal against asphalt, the searing pain, the betrayal of the man she had trusted, who left her broken on the road, and the hands, steady strong, that had pulled her from the wreckage. She closed her eyes, almost hearing the voice again. "Hold on. You're going to live." When she opened them, her gaze landed on something resting on the counter, a faded cloth folded neatly. She rose almost without thinking and picked it up. It was a handkerchief frayed at the edges, stained with years of use. Across the fabric, stitched in uneven thread, were the words, "To those we couldn't save." Her breath caught. She had seen this before. Her knees weakened, and she gripped the counter to steady herself. The night of her crash had blurred into pain and darkness, but she remembered that cloth pressed against her bleeding back. The soldier who saved her had carried it. She never forgot the words. And now here it was. "Ellie," Raven whispered, her voice raw. "Your father. That handkerchief." Ellie tilted her head, curious. "Oh, that Daddy never goes anywhere without it. Says it reminds him to keep trying, even when he can't fix everything." Raven sank into the nearest chair, her eyes locked on the faded cloth, as if it were a ghost. All these years, she had told herself it was luck, chance, or fate that she'd survived. But the truth stood only a few feet away, asleep in the back of the diner. The quiet man in the apron was no stranger. He was her savior. For the first time in years, Raven felt the weight of gratitude crash over her, mingling with a grief she had buried. Tears burned her eyes, but she blinked them back, unwilling to break in front of a child. Ellie reached across the table and slipped her small hand into Raven's, her touch warm and unguarded. "You don't have to be scared," she said, with a smile too wise for her age. "Daddy's light never goes out." Raven squeezed her hand, her throat too tight to answer. For the first time in a long while, she allowed herself to believe it. And in that quiet moment, while snow raged outside, and the world seemed intent on burying them all, two unlikely souls, one scarred by betrayal, and the other too young to understand, it found comfort in the same truth. The dark was real, but so was the light, And in the heart of the Rockies, the light was named Martin Greaves. The storm still clawed at the windows by morning, relentless and merciless. Snowdrifts had climbed halfway up the diner's doors, muffling the world in a heavy white silence. Inside the North Star, Diner felt like a sanctuary, warm and alive with the quiet murmurs of bikers finishing their breakfasts. The smell of coffee and bacon lingered in the air, mingling with the faint scent of leather and gasoline. Ellie giggled softly as she delivered pancakes shaped into lopsided hearts, her laughter briefly dissolving the heaviness that hung in the room. To her, this gathering was almost magical. So many strangers bound not by fear, but by gratitude, crowding into the little diner that had always felt too empty. But Martin wasn't smiling. He stood at the grill, spatula in hand, his expression steady but distant. His mind wasn't on the eggs sizzling before him. It was on the folded letter tucked into his apron pocket, the one that ticked down the days until everything he had built would be gone. At 9:12 a.m., the bell above the diner's door rang, and the storm seemed to follow someone in. A woman swept through the doorway, shaking snow from her coat like a bird ridding itself of water. She wasn't dressed for the storm in layers of leather or denim like the bikers. No, her long wool coat was tailored, her boots polished, and her hair pinned back in a way that spoke of control and calculation. She carried herself with the authority of someone used to doors opening for her. Darla Voss, Regional Bank Director. The warmth in the diner faltered as she entered, her sharp eyes scanning the room before settling on Martin. With each click of her heels against the linoleum floor, the silence grew. "Mr. Greaves," she said crisply, her voice cutting through the hum of the storm. "We need to talk." Martin laid the spatula down with deliberate calm and faced her. "Morning, Darla." Her lips thinned. "You received the notice." He nodded once. "Then you know why I'm here. The foreclosure will proceed. But given recent developments," her eyes flicked briefly to the row of bikers watching her like hawks, "I thought it best to offer you an opportunity to resolve this with dignity." Ellie tilted her head, sensing the tension, but Martin placed a protective hand on her shoulder. "What kind of opportunity?" he asked evenly. Darla produced a slim folder from her bag and slid it onto the counter. "Sign this," she said. "An early surrender of the property. You'll be relieved of certain penalties, and the transition will be smoother." One of the bikers, a broad man with arms inked from wrist to shoulder, leaned forward in his booth. Transition to who Darla's gaze didn't waver. A developer, a casino group looking to expand in this area. She smirked faintly, as though it were obvious. "This diner, charming as it is, sits on land far more valuable than pancakes and coffee." The words hit Martin like a knife. He'd fought battles in deserts and cities, watched men bleed for ground that wasn't worth a damn, and yet here in this diner was the only piece of earth that had ever felt like home. And now it was nothing more than an entry on a balance sheet to her. The bikers shifted, murmuring. Chairs scraped. The tension rose like a storm inside the storm. Dust slammed his mug down, coffee sloshing over the rim. "You think you can just erase this place?" After what he's done, another biker stood, voice low but dangerous. "Lady, you don't know who you're talking to." The diner bristled with heat fists, clenching eyes narrowing. But Martin lifted his hand, and the room stilled. His voice was calm, steady, almost gentle. "No," he said. "We don't fight with fists. Not here." He looked at Darla, his expression unwavering. "This place isn't for sale. Not to you, not to anyone. North Star stays open until the light goes out on its own." Darla's smirk faltered for just a moment. She looked around the diner at the leather-clad strangers glaring at her, at Ellie clutching her father's apron, at Martin standing firm as stone, and something like uncertainty flickered across her face. But it vanished as quickly as it came. "You have 7 days," she said, coldly, snapping the folder shut. "No more." With that, she turned sharply on her heel and strode out into the storm, leaving the warmth of the diner behind. The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the faint whistle of wind seeping through the doorframe. Ellie tugged at Martin's apron. "Daddy." "What if she takes the diner?" Martin crouched, meeting her worried eyes. "Then we do what we always do, Bug. We keep the light on as long as we can." The bikers exchanged glances, their loyalty crystallizing in that moment. They had followed Martin through storms before, in deserts and in cities, and now they saw another battle, not of bullets, but of endurance. And for the first time, it was clear this wasn't just Martin's fight anymore. Night fell again, heavy and unrelenting, as if the storm itself refused to let go of the Rockies. The North Star diner glowed like a stubborn lantern, its windows fogged with warmth, while the wind shrieked and clawed outside. Inside, the air carried a strange blend of exhaustion and reverence. 15 bikers had claimed the booths and stools as if they belonged there, their leather jackets drying by the heater, their helmets stacked neatly like soldiers at rest. Ellie darted from booth to booth, full of the restless energy only a child could muster. She offered crayons, napkins, even little jokes that made hardened men crack reluctant smiles. More than once, laughter rolled through the diner, surprising everyone, including Martin. For years, the place had been too quiet. Now, in the heart of a blizzard, it pulsed with life. Still, there were undercurrents that no laughter could erase. Stories lingered at the edges of the room, fragments of battles, scars, and the weight of debts unpaid. The bikers carried them like invisible luggage, and slowly, one by one, they began to set them down. It started with a wiry man, whose hands shook as he held his mug. "Back in Ho 3, he murmured, eyes fixed on the steam I was bleeding out in a desert. Somebody tied a tourniquet on me when I couldn't even hold my own rifle. Never asked my name. Just kept me alive until the bird came. That somebody," his voice cracked. "It was you, wasn't it?" Martin, standing behind the counter, didn't answer. He didn't need to. His silence was confirmation enough. Another spoke, younger, but worn in spirit. Winter of 11. No shoes, frostbite climbing in. Out of nowhere, a man shoved a pair of dry boots into my hands. Never told me his name. Just walked away. He looked up now, his eyes shining. Same man standing in front of me. The room hushed, and even Ellie paused her chatter. The truth was weaving itself into the diner, like threads pulled tight. Martin Greaves wasn't just some veteran who had found refuge in pancakes and coffee. He was the unnamed figure etched into each of their pasts, the soldier, the stranger, the quiet presence who had carried them when the world had tried to bury them. And then Jax Monroe stood, broad-shouldered with a gray streak in his beard, and a presence that commanded attention. Jax had said little since arriving. But now he rose slowly, every eye following him. He unzipped his jacket, revealing the worn leather vest beneath. Across the back stretched the patch of his chapter, but on the front, stitched over his heart, was a smaller patch, old and faded. The diner seemed to still as he tapped it with one calloused finger. "This, Jax," said his voice gravelly, "was given to me by a man we called the Silent One. Kandahar. 4. Our unit was trapped fire on 3 sides. I was 20 yards from bleeding out when he dragged me across the sand. He never spoke, never even told me his name. But he saved my life. Saved half of us that night." He looked at Martin, then his jaw tight, his voice thick. And now I see his face again. Ellie tilted her head, confusion clouding her innocent features. "The Silent One," she whispered. Jax nodded solemnly. "A ghost of a man. Thought we'd lost him years ago. Turns out he's been right here flipping burgers in the mountains. A stunned silence followed, broken only by the hiss of the old heater. Ellie turned to her father, her small hands clutching his apron. "Daddy, was that really you?" Martin crouched down so his eyes met hers. His face was lined with weariness, but his gaze was steady, unshaken. "Bug," he said softly. "Sometimes it's not about names. It's about being there when someone needs you." Her eyes shimmered with tears she didn't understand, but she nodded anyway. The bikers, men and women hardened by road and war, looked at one another and then back at Martin. For years they had whispered stories of the Silent One, unsure if he was memory myth or man. Now they knew the truth. Martin Greaves had carried them all. Raven leaned against the wall, her arms crossed her face, shadowed, but her eyes blazing. "So it's true," she said quietly. "You've been saving ghosts your whole life, and you never asked for anything back." Martin said nothing. He simply turned, picked up a plate, and slid it across the counter, as if to remind them all this was his way. Service, not recognition. Deeds, not words. But the weight of revelation lingered unshakable. As the wind howled outside, the bikers sat straighter, their gazes sharper, their loyalty crystallizing. They were no longer just guests hiding from a storm. They were soldiers reunited with their commander, bound again, not by patches or colors, but by gratitude and unspoken vows. The Silent One lived, and none of them would ever let the light go out again. The diner had quieted again as night pressed its weight against the glass. The storm outside still raged, snow piling high in drifts that looked more like barricades than weather. Inside, the bikers settled into uneasy slumber, boots, kicked-off arms, folded across chests, leather jackets pulled tight. The air hummed with the silence of men and women who had finally, after years, glimpsed the truth behind their own survival. Martin stayed awake. He always did. He stood near the counter, one hand wrapped around a coffee mug, eyes tracing the storm beyond the windows. To anyone else, he looked carved from stone, but inside his mind, memories walked like ghosts across a battlefield. Kandahar, the desert nights, the faces of those who never made it home. He could still feel the patch of cloth pressed against his chest, the one that carried the words to those we couldn't save. At the far end of the diner, Raven Calder stirred. She had tried to sleep, but her body resisted rest. Too many nights haunted by old betrayals, too many scars burned into her skin. She rose quietly, stepping outside into the sharp bite of the storm, her boots crunching against the frozen ground. The Harley, parked just beyond the diner's glow, looked as restless as she felt its chrome-frosted white, its leather seat dusted with snow. She laid a hand on the handlebars, the cold seeping into her gloves. The wind whipped strands of her dark hair across her face, but she didn't move. Her other hand drifted to her neck, where a small leather cord hung beneath her jacket. Slowly, she pulled it free. Dangling from the cord was a hollowed-out bullet casing, worn smooth by time. She turned it in her fingers until the tiny piece of folded paper inside slid halfway out. She knew every crease, every faded mark by heart. She read the words again, though she didn't need to. He never spoke. But he held me until the ambulance came. The crash had been years ago. She had been 19, foolish, chasing the wrong crowd. The road had taken her down, and she'd woken in a hospital alive, but scarred with only that note and the faintest memory of a man's hands keeping her tethered to life. She had never known who he was. Until now. "Can't sleep either." The voice came from behind. She turned sharply, hand tightening on the bullet casing. It was Martin stepping out into the storm with his coffee mug still in hand, snowflakes melting instantly against the steam. He wasn't wearing his coat, just the faded shirt with sleeves rolled to his elbows. his arms marked with faint lines of scars that looked almost like maps. "No," she admitted, her voice hoarse. For a long moment they stood in silence, the storm whistling between them. Finally, Raven held out the bullet casing. Her hand trembled slightly. "This," she said. Her voice breaking was left with me after the crash. I thought it was just fate, some nameless angel who disappeared into the night. But it was you, wasn't it? Martin stared at the small object, then at her. His jaw tightened, but he didn't answer right away. "Why didn't you tell me?" She pressed her eyes, flashing with something between anger and gratitude. Martin took a slow breath. His voice, when it came, was steady but heavy. "Because it wasn't about me. It was about making sure you had a chance to keep living." Raven looked away, her chest heaving. The scar on her back throbbed with memory, a wound that had never fully healed. She wanted to scream, to rage against the silence he carried like a shield. But instead, all she felt was a wave of relief, so sharp it left her weak. "You knew," she whispered. "All this time, you knew." He shook his head. "No, I didn't know it was you. I just knew someone needed saving." The words, simple as they were, cut through her walls. Tears burned her eyes hot against the freezing air. She hated that he saw them, hated that her armor was cracking. But in that moment, under the storm's howl, she felt something she hadn't in years, safe. They stepped back into the diner together, where the warmth wrapped around them like a blanket. Martin set his mug on the counter and leaned against it, his silence unyielding but not unkind. Raven sank into the booth closest to the fire. She glanced at him, her voice softer now. "You've been carrying everyone else's ghosts. When do you let someone carry yours?" Martin's eyes flicked to Ellie asleep in the corner, her sketchbook clutched to her chest. "I already have someone carrying mine," he said quietly. Raven followed his gaze, her heart tightening. She thought she had nothing left to believe in, but here was this man, this child, this diner in the middle of a storm, and for the first time in years, the darkness inside her didn't feel endless. That night, she and Martin spoke by the fire, not about promises or futures, not about debts or scars. Just about the little things, the way Ellie hummed when she drew the stubborn streak that kept the North Star diner open, no matter the storm. Raven didn't ask for more, and Martin didn't offer. It was enough. For in the silence between them, something fragile but real had begun to grow. Morning came reluctantly, dragging its gray light through the storm. The Rockies were buried deeper than before, roads vanished beneath mountains of snow. To anyone else, the world looked sealed off, imprisoned by winter. But inside the North Star diner, something had shifted. The bikers who had stumbled in the night before now moved with an ease that felt almost like belonging. They helped Ellie clear plates. They stoked the old furnace with extra logs. They even teased one another with gruff laughter that filled the diner in a way Martin had almost forgotten was possible. For once, the place didn't feel like a relic waiting to die. It felt alive. Yet beneath the laughter, an unspoken tension remained. Darla's visit still hung heavy in the air, her words like frost on the window, 7 days. The diner's future teetered on the edge of ruin, and everyone knew it. By 6 a.m., the storm's howl had dulled, replaced by a strange quiet. It was the kind of silence that came before something extraordinary. Martin, pouring himself another cup of black coffee, felt it before he heard it. A vibration. Faint at first, then stronger. The walls seemed to hum, the mugs on the counter trembled. At first he thought it was thunder rolling off the mountains, but then came the sound, deep, guttural, unmistakable. Engines. Not one. Not 10. Dozens. Ellie pressed her face to the fogged-up window, her breath leaving tiny circles of clear glass. "Daddy," she whispered, "they're coming." From the valley below, headlights began to pierce the veil of snow. First a handful cutting through the gray, then more. The rumble grew until it shook the diner itself, a thunder made of chrome and steel. Martin stepped outside his boots, sinking into the snow. The cold bit into his face, but he didn't move. He just stood and watched as the procession emerged. 1 Harley, then 2, then 10, then 50. The road filled with them, an unbroken line of riders pushing through the storm. Wyoming, Utah, Arizona, Texas. Their patches marked chapters from across the country. Men and women alike, their engines roaring defiance against the blizzard. By the time the last rider crested the hill, the count was clear. 102. 102 headlights glowing in the storm. 102 engines rumbling like a single heartbeat. 102 debts being repaid unasked, but freely given. The bikers inside spilled out to join Martin, their breath rising in white clouds of disbelief. Dust's eyes widened his lips, forming the words without sound. They came. Raven stepped up beside Martin, her leather jacket dusted with snow, her gaze locked on the endless line of bikes. "You've lit a fire you can't put out," she said softly. Martin didn't answer. He didn't need to. The sight before them was answer enough. The procession pulled into the diner's lot, engines idling as snow whipped through the air. Riders dismounted, helmets came off and faces weathered by years, and roads stared back at Martin. Some were old, some young, but all carried the same look, the look of those who owed their lives to a man who had never asked for their names. One by one they approached. No speeches, no fanfare, just nods, grips of the shoulder, quiet words of thanks drowned by the storm. Each gesture was simple, but together they became something larger, a chorus of gratitude that didn't need volume to be heard. Ellie clutched her father's hand, her small body trembling not from cold, but from awe. "Daddy," she whispered, "they're all here for you." Martin's throat tightened. He wanted to tell her it wasn't about him, that it never had been. But as he looked out over the sea of bikes, the sea of faces, he realized something he hadn't before. The light he kept burning wasn't just for strangers lost in the storm. It was for the lives tethered to his in ways he had never imagined. Raven, standing close enough for her voice to reach him through the wind, spoke again. "They remember. Even if you never wanted them to, they remember." The engines began to die down one by one, the storm's silence reclaiming the valley. But in their place, the light of 102 headlights lingered, cutting through the snow like stars pulled down to earth. Inside the diner, the tables filled again. Riders squeezed shoulder to shoulder, laughter and clatter rising above the storm's howl. Ellie raced between them with crayons and pancakes, her joy uncontainable. And Martin behind the counter looked out at the scene with something he hadn't felt in years. Hope. The diner wasn't just surviving another night. It was becoming something larger than itself. A sanctuary. A beacon. And for the first time, Martin Greaves allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, the light would never go out. The storm had not broken, but the diner's walls now pulsed with life. 102 bikes filled the lot, their chrome buried under snow, their owners crammed shoulder to shoulder inside North Star Diner. Boots stomped to shake off ice jackets dripped onto the floor, and the smell of exhaust and leather mingled with the sweet scent of maple syrup and fresh coffee. The storm outside had swallowed the world whole, but in here, the world felt reborn. Ellie could hardly contain herself. She darted between booths laughing as she offered crayons and napkins to the sea of strangers who grinned at her as if she were their little sister or daughter or light. Hardened bikers who bore scars across faces and arms softened when she placed a pancake shaped like a star in front of them. Laughter rippled through the diner, genuine and raw, like it hadn't touched some of them in years. But amidst the joy, a heaviness hovered. For every laugh, there was also a glance at Martin's steady quiet. Martin, whose silence reminded them of the weight they all carried. They hadn't come just to ride through snow or sip coffee. They had come because the man at the counter had once held their lives in his hands, and most of them had never had the chance to look him in the eye again. The murmur died when an older biker stepped forward. His beard was white as frost. His shoulders stooped, but his eyes burned with something that cut through the chatter. He reached into his jacket, pulled out a worn photograph, and pressed it into Martin's hands. The diner seemed to lean in. Martin looked down. His breath caught. The photograph was grainy, taken decades ago on a battlefield far from home. It showed a young soldier, dirt streaked across his face, carrying another man slung across his shoulders. His mouth was set in grim determination, his eyes fixed ahead. The wounded man's blood stained his uniform, yet the soldier moved forward without hesitation. It was him. The old biker's voice cracked as he spoke. "We thought you died that day. Thought the desert swallowed you whole. But you didn't. You carried us out." His hand trembled as it stayed on Martin's shoulder. "I owe you every sunrise I've seen since." The photograph passed from hand to hand, each biker seeing the ghost of the man they now recognized in flesh. Heads bowed, not in worship, but in reverence. Then a woman stepped forward. Her hair was streaked with silver, her eyes lined with years of pain. She held herself with the same toughness as the others, but her voice faltered when she spoke. "You're the reason I'm still alive to raise my boy," she said. "I was left bleeding on a roadside, and you sat with me until the ambulance came. Never told me your name, just told me to breathe." Her lips trembled. "He's in college now. He writes me every week, and I owe that to you." Martin stood behind the counter, unable to move. His throat closed. His hands tightened around the photograph until the edges curled. He had carried these memories alone for so long, convinced they were his burdens. Yet here they stood, living, breathing proof that his silence had not erased the truth. Ellie, still small and uncomprehending of war, but not of love, clutched her father's arm. "Daddy," she whispered, "they remember." The words broke something inside him. His eyes, so long, guarded, softened. For the first time, he allowed himself to look fully at the sea of faces, their scars, their gratitude, their tears, and accept what he had always pushed away. He had not fought in vain. At the back of the diner, Darla Voss stood frozen. She had entered with cold precision, prepared to enforce the bank's will, prepared to tear down what she considered nothing more than a failing roadside diner. But now she stood among living testimonies, each one dismantling her certainty. She watched as men and women, once shadows, now laid their gratitude bare at Martin's feet. And in their stories, she recognized something terrifying. She had misjudged not just a man, but the very measure of worth. The air grew heavy with silence again. Not empty silence, but sacred. The kind that filled churches, that pressed down on battlefields after the guns went quiet. Martin cleared his throat, his voice gravelly uneven. "I didn't save all of you," he said softly. "There are names, faces, that I couldn't bring home." His gaze dropped to the handkerchief tucked in his pocket, words stitched across it like a wound to those we couldn't save. "I carry them every day." Raven, standing nearby, stepped forward. Her hand brushed his arm, not as comfort, but as anchor. And yet she said, her voice steady, "You carried enough. You carried us." The room exhaled 100 voices nodding in unison. Outside, the storm still howled. But inside, the diner glowed brighter than ever, not just from the lights, but from the weight of memory, the presence of gratitude, and the quiet truth that sometimes the world remembers even when the man at the center rise to forget. The storm finally began to ease, though the drifts outside stood like frozen walls. Inside the North Star, diner throbbed with energy, laughter stories, the scrape of forks against plates. The booths were packed shoulder to shoulder, leather brushing leather, as 102 bikers found warmth in a place that had nearly been lost. Martin moved behind the counter with his usual steady rhythm, sliding plates across refilling mugs, his face unreadable. But inside, he felt something he hadn't allowed in years release. The weight of anonymity had cracked. The ghosts he carried were no longer just his. They were shared now, witnessed by those who owed him their very breath. Ellie danced between tables, her sketchbook clutched under one arm, crayons under the other. She had made it her mission to capture every face in the diner, pressing color onto paper with the seriousness of an artist. Each time she handed over a drawing, the hardened bikers softened, grinning like children at her messy portraits. But beneath the joy lay a question too large to ignore. What now? Gratitude alone wouldn't pay the debt hanging over Martin's head. The diner still stood on borrowed time, and Darla's deadline still loomed. It was Dust who broke the silence. He stood at the center of the room, his voice shaking but loud enough to carry. We all owe him. Every one of us. And it's about time we start paying it back. Heads turned. The room stilled. We ride thousands of miles for each other. Dust continued. We fight, bleed, and patch each other up. But this, he gestured around the diner, his eyes burning. This is more than just a place to eat. It's a light. It's where some of us found a reason to keep breathing. If it goes dark, part of us does too. Murmurs rose. Bikers dug into their jackets, pulling out wallets worn by miles of road. Bills slapped onto the tables, crumpled fives, and fresh 20s rolled stacks and envelopes tucked deep in pockets. Coins clinked into empty mugs. It wasn't ceremony. It was instinct. Raw and urgent. By the time the money was gathered, the pile stretched across 2 tables. Dust and Raven counted it twice, hands trembling. When they finished, Dust cleared his throat. $86,200, he said. The room erupted in cheers, fists pounding the tables. Some whooped, others wiped at their eyes. But that wasn't all. A young man with ink crawling up his neck stood next, holding up a folded set of papers. I'm an architect, he said, his voice hesitant. 2 years ago, I almost drove my bike off a cliff. He stopped me, fed me, kept me alive long enough to think straight. I never said thank you, but I kept working because of him. And now he unfolded the pages, spreading them across the counter. This is my thank you. Blueprints, detailed sketches of an expanded diner with a second wing built into the hillside bunk rooms for travelers, a play space for kids, a small counseling office marked healing room. This isn't just a diner, the architect said firmly. It can be a stop for anyone. Bikers, vets, wanderers, anyone carrying weight too heavy for the road. A place to rest, a place to heal. The room grew still again, this time with awe. Men and women who had thought their only sanctuary was the wind, and the road looked at the paper and saw something else, permanence. Ellie's eyes sparkled as she leaned over the blueprints. Daddy, look, she whispered. It's like the diner's getting a big brother. Martin studied the drawings quietly. His chest tightened, not from pride, but from something deeper. Fear of hope. He had trained himself never to dream beyond survival. But now, in the hands of the very people he had once saved, a dream was being laid at his feet. Raven placed her hand over the blueprints. We can call it the healing stop, she suggested, her voice steady but her eyes shining. a promise that this light will never go out. Not just for us, but for anyone who finds their way here. Jax rose, then his voice like gravel. Each chapter takes a vow. Once a year, no matter what we ride back here. We eat, we pay, we sit with the man who saved us. We keep this place alive as long as we've got engines running. One by one, voices agreed. Utah, Wyoming, Arizona, Texas. Pledges sealed not with ink, but with grit. Martin looked at them all, his throat too tight for words. He wanted to tell them they didn't need to do this, that the diner wasn't worth their vows. But as he glanced at Ellie, her small hands tracing the lines of the blueprint, her face glowing with possibility, he realized he couldn't deny her the future they were building together. He finally spoke, his voice low but clear. This light was never mine alone. If you want to keep it burning, then it belongs to all of us now. The room erupted again, not with noise, but with purpose. Hands clasped, shoulders gripped, nods exchanged. A ledger of kindness had been written, not on paper, but in lives, in vows, in the promise that one small diner in the Rockies would stand as long as there were roads to ride. And for the first time, Martin let himself believe. Darla Voss had always believed herself immune to sentiment, numbers, contracts, and collateral. These were the truths she lived by. To her, emotions were liabilities, dangerous illusions that clouded judgment. But standing in the corner of North Star Diner, watching bikers from across the country throw down their life savings. For a man who asked nothing of them, she felt her certainty fracture. The laughter, the vows, the tears. It all unsettled her. She had come to enforce the law of the bank, the language of foreclosure and transfer of property. Yet here she was confronted with another kind of law, unwritten but undeniable loyalty born of kindness. She turned, intending to leave before the warmth of the room dissolved her resolve. But as she reached the door, a figure stepped into her path. A tall, weathered biker, with eyes the color of storm clouds. His name patch read, Miles. His hand, rough and scarred, held out a folded piece of paper. "You dropped something," he said. His voice was calm, but the weight in it rooted her where she stood. Darla frowned. I don't recall. Miles pressed the paper into her palm and stepped back. "Read it." Confused, she unfolded the letter. Her breath caught as she recognized the handwriting. Her son's. Her hands trembled. She scanned the words, her lips moving silently. "Mom, if you ever find this, it means I couldn't fight anymore. Don't blame yourself. Just know that before I left, I met a man. A cook at some roadside diner. He didn't ask me questions. He just made me a meal, looked me in the eye like I mattered. For a moment, I felt seen. Tell him thank you if you can." E. The paper blurred through her tears. Her knees buckled, and she sank onto a chair, the storm outside forgotten. She had lost her son years ago to the war inside his own mind. She had buried the guilt, hardened herself into steel, convinced herself there was nothing she could have done. But now, here was a letter telling her otherwise, that someone, this man she had come to destroy, had been there for her boy when she hadn't been. Her shoulders shook. She pressed the letter to her chest, the sobs breaking free, raw and unrestrained. The diner hushed. Conversations stilled. All eyes turned to Darla as the woman who had marched in with cold certainty now sat trembling in the corner, undone by grief and truth. Martin stepped forward. He didn't speak, didn't try to comfort her with platitudes. He simply stood his presence, steady. His silence offering the kind of solace words could never give. Darla lifted her gaze to him, her eyes red, her voice shattered. "It was you," she whispered. "You were the one who fed him, who gave him that one moment of peace." Martin's jaw tightened, but he nodded once. Her tears fell harder. "And I I came here to take everything from you." Raven moved closer, her voice sharp, but not cruel. "Then don't. You have the power to end this, Darla, to let this place keep standing. Don't bury the light your son clung to." The silence pressed heavy, broken only by the hiss of the heater. Darla looked around the room at the faces scarred by war, at the bikers clutching their mugs as if they were prayers, at Ellie curled up with her sketchbook in a booth, drawing the world as she wanted it to be. And then she looked back at Martin, who asked nothing, demanded nothing, but stood as the embodiment of what her son had written, a man who gave without question. Slowly, with hands that still trembled, she reached into her bag. She pulled out the folder she had once slid across the counter with ruthless efficiency. The contract, the foreclosure papers. And with a sound that seemed to echo louder than the storm itself, she tore them down the middle. Then again. And again. Until the pieces fluttered to the floor like dead leaves. Gasps rose. Ellie sat up, her eyes wide. The bikers exchanged stunned looks. Darla's voice, when it came, was ragged but firm. "The bank won't take this place. Not while I'm the one signing the papers. Consider this debt forgiven." A roar of cheers erupted through the diner. Fists slammed tables. Voices shouted in triumph. Boots stomped the floor. Ellie leapt from her booth and ran to her father, hugging his waist with all her strength. Martin closed his eyes. Relief wasn't something he allowed himself often, but now it poured through him like warmth after years of frost. He looked at Darla not with victory, but with quiet understanding. "Thank you," he said simply. Darla shook her head, tears still streaking her cheeks. "No. Don't thank me. Thank him." She pressed her son's letter to her chest once more. "He's the one who found peace in your kindness. I only wish I'd learned from him sooner." The room softened. The bikers, once bristling with suspicion, now looked at Darla with something closer to forgiveness. She had been broken open not by threats or defiance, but by the undeniable truth of love and sacrifice. For the first time in years, Darla Voss let herself feel. And in that feeling, she chose redemption. The storm had finally loosened its grip on the Rockies. By evening, the snow had slowed to a gentle fall, drifting like feathers across the quiet valley. The lot outside North Star Diner still brimmed with motorcycles, their chrome buried beneath a white blanket, but inside the crowd had thinned. Many of the riders had begun their long journeys back to their chapters, leaving behind only a few who lingered. The laughter of the morning had softened into something quieter, more intimate, more reverent. Martin wiped down the counter slowly, his motions deliberate, his silence unchanged. But for the first time in years, his silence wasn't heavy. It wasn't armor. Tonight, it was simply peace. Ellie sat at her favorite booth by the window, her crayons scattered across the table. She was drawing again, her small fingers smudged with color. The storm clouds had parted just enough for a sliver of moonlight to pour through the window, bathing her page in silver. Raven slid into the booth across from her, still in her leather jacket, her dark hair loose now falling across her shoulders. She watched Ellie for a long moment before speaking. "What are you drawing this time, kid?" Ellie grinned and turned the sketchbook around. On the page was the diner itself, drawn with bold strokes of yellow crayon for the lights. Beside it stood 3 figures, Martin, Ellie, and Raven, hand in hand. Above them, in Ellie's scrawling handwriting, were the words, "The light never goes out." Raven's throat tightened. She looked down quickly, blinking away the sudden sting in her eyes. "That's beautiful," she whispered. Ellie beamed, then yawned, curling against the booth's cushion. Within moments, her eyelids drooped, and her breathing evened out into the soft rhythm of sleep. Her crayon rolled off the table, clattering quietly against the floor. Raven reached out to pick it up, but her hand brushed against something else instead. A small silver wind chime, delicate and glinting in the moonlight. She froze her fingers, trembling as she lifted it. "I thought I lost this," she murmured, her voice breaking. "The night of the crash, I never saw it again." Martin stepped over, drawn by her words. He glanced at the object in her hand and nodded. "You dropped it," he said softly. "I kept it." Raven's eyes widened. "All these years." She turned the chime in her hand, its tiny bells catching the light. Why, Martin leaned against the booth, his gaze fixed on the silver. "Because it reminded me someone had survived." His voice was low but steady. "When the ghosts get too heavy sometimes, you need proof that saving even one person is enough." Raven swallowed hard. The scar on her back seemed to burn, but not with pain, with recognition, with memory. And now she asked, her voice barely more than a whisper. He looked at her finally, his eyes unflinching. "Now I think you should keep it. As a promise, that whatever storm comes, you'll remember you made it through." Her hands shook as she closed them around the chime. Tears blurred her vision, but she didn't hide them. "Not this time." "You don't understand," she said, her voice breaking. "That night, I thought my life was over. I didn't just lose blood on that road, I lost faith. Faith in people. Faith in myself. And then, you." Martin shifted his gaze, steady but heavy. "I'm no savior, Raven." "No," she whispered, her eyes shining. "You're something rarer. You're the reason people like me get the chance to keep fighting." The diner was silent except for the soft rattle of the wind against the windows. Raven reached across the table, then her hand trembling slightly, and laid it over his. His hand was warm, calloused, solid. He didn't pull away. For a long moment they sat in the booth by the window, the moonlight spilling across their faces, Ellie sleeping peacefully beside them. No promises were spoken, no declarations made. But in that quiet space, in the presence of scars and survival, something deeper than words passed between them. Martin squeezed her hand gently, his eyes softening in a way they hadn't in years. And Raven, who had built walls high enough to keep out the world, let them crumble. Ellie stirred in her sleep, a faint smile tugging at her lips. As if, even in dreams, she knew the truth. The light that burned in the diner wasn't just its neon sign, but the people within it, her father herself, and now perhaps Raven too. The silver wind chime trembled in Raven's hand, its soft notes ringing like a fragile promise in the heart of the storm. And for the first time in years, Martin allowed himself to believe in tomorrow. 6 months later, the Rockies had shed their winter shroud and bloomed with spring. The roads once buried under snow now wound open and alive, carrying travelers from every direction. At the bend, where the pines thinned, the North Star diner stood brighter than ever, its neon sign glowing steady against the blue mountain sky. But it was no longer just a roadside diner. The renovations had finished weeks earlier. A new wing extended off the main building, its wood and stone blending with the mountain landscape. Signs marked the additions: rest stop, children's playroom, healing room. On the side wall, painted in careful, bold strokes, were the words pledged by the riders themselves: North Star, for the lost, the tired, and the still fighting. Inside, the booths were filled not only with bikers, but also veterans, hikers, and families passing through. Laughter mingled with the clink of coffee cups, the murmur of stories being told, the sound of children chasing each other around Ellie's art display. For she now had her own corner, a wall of framed drawings, her North Star collection. Crayon portraits of bikers, of Raven, of Martin, all crude and colorful, yet carrying more heart than any photograph. Ellie herself was perched on a stool at the counter, swinging her legs, humming while she colored. Her braids had grown longer, her smile wider. Every few minutes, someone stopped by her to admire a drawing, and she beamed as though she were the artist of a great cathedral mural. Martin moved through the diner with his usual steady presence, spatula in hand, apron tied neatly over his old military shirt. But the weight in his shoulders was lighter now, his silence softer. He still didn't speak more than necessary, but the quiet no longer felt like a wall. It felt like peace. At booth number 4 by the window, Raven sat with a mug of coffee, her leather jacket draped over the seat beside her. Around her neck hung the silver wind chime, its delicate bells, catching the light whenever she moved. She had become more than a guest. She was part of the place now. Sometimes she helped Ellie with her drawings. Sometimes she rode escort with bikers traveling in. And sometimes, when no one was looking, she laughed. A real laugh, free and unguarded. The diner had found its rhythm again. But beneath it all, there was a truth that lingered like the hum of a motorcycle engine. The storm that once threatened to extinguish this place had instead ignited something indestructible. That truth revealed itself again on a quiet afternoon when the bell above the door jingled and a young man stepped inside. He couldn't have been more than 20, his jacket thin, his face pale with exhaustion. He looked like someone who had been running for a long time, maybe from the cold, maybe from something heavier. He hesitated at the door, uncertain. Martin noticed. He wiped his hands on his apron, poured a fresh mug of coffee, and slid it onto the counter before the boy even sat down. "Quan Luan Mo," he said quietly, his voice carrying across the room. "Even when the world closes." The boy blinked, startled. His eyes filled, though he said nothing. He lowered himself onto a stool, wrapped his hands around the warm mug, and for the first time in who knows how long breathed. The room hushed, not with judgment, but with welcome. The bikers, Raven, Ellie, everyone present recognized the moment for what it was. A pattern repeating, a circle closing, another life pulled back from the storm. Ellie slipped off her stool, scampered over, and placed a crayon in the boy's hand. "You can draw too," she said with a grin. The boy smiled faintly, the kind of smile that comes only when the first crack of light pierces the dark. Martin stood behind the counter watching. His chest ached, not with sorrow, but with gratitude. The ghosts would never leave him, but neither would the light. And now, the diner wasn't just his to guard. It belonged to everyone who had found their way through its doors. Outside, the rumble of engines grew again. Bikers from Wyoming, Arizona, Utah, and beyond rolled into the lot honoring their vow. One by one, headlights flared against the mountain dusk, 100 strong, then more, each beam a reminder of the night when gratitude overcame despair. Inside, laughter rose. The jukebox sparked to life, playing an old tune that mingled with the sound of Ellie's crayon scratching across paper. Raven leaned across booth Miaudiwar, her hand brushing Martin's as he passed. She didn't need to speak. Neither did he. Because in the glow of the North Star, diner words were unnecessary. The light stayed on. Always. Before we go, I'd love to hear from you. Where are you watching this story from? Share your hometown or country in the comments below. I always enjoy seeing how far our light reaches. If this story touched your heart, I invite you to subscribe to the channel. That way you won't miss the next journey we'll take together, each one filled with hope, kindness, and a reminder that love still matters in this world. And finally, thank you truly for spending your time with us today. Your presence here means more than you know. Until next time, may the light in your life never go out.